to the cloud.
This meeting is being recorded.
Got it.
Okay.
It should notify me there it is being recorded. Either leave meeting or say, okay, okay, good. Well, this is the recording. We have about a minute before start time. So welcome everybody. And, to warm up the audience, I just want to let everybody know that this is the first time I've been the host on one of these events. And I believe this is the first time that Winn Schwartau has presented on one of these events. And I've been, I was actually a founding member, lifetime member of the IPA. When it started, I've been very inactive for the most part. But I've decided to become more active. And if any of you want to become more active, you're able to do so by volunteering your time. So I just wanted to let you know that you can volunteer your time and have more control over the stuff that we see during these brown bags and similar sorts of events. I typically want to start on time. We do have quite a few people in the room at this point in time, but most people like to wait, give it a few minutes for more people to join. We currently have enough people, I think, to get going. So unless anybody objects, I'm going to proceed with my introductory slides, which won't interfere at all with your enjoyment of Winn's talk. So we have 5 minutes of announcements. I don't have a whole lot of announcements to make, but perhaps somebody else does. If anybody else has an announcement to make, please unmute yourself and do so. I prefer not to control your behaviors and have you control yourselves.
Yeah. Hey, Fred, John Bicknell here real quick. So for those of, thanks everybody who joined. Just a couple of quick items. IPA is putting a big emphasis now on communities of interest. So we're forming geographic communities of interest. There's a event coming up in a few weeks in the National Capital Region. They're calling it something else, but the DC area, I don't know. There's a different acronym, but there's one happening in DC. There's one in Tampa. There's a gentleman interested in standing something up in Colorado Springs, Tacoma, Washington. We just got an inquiry from a researcher out of Auburn University to put together a community of interest in Alabama. So wherever you reside, there's some international communities forming as well. So if you, like Fred said, if you have some energy to contribute to IPA, consider joining one of these communities. And if you don't know what community you should join, get in touch with us and we'll be sure to get you connected up with somebody. So
there you go. Excellent.
That'll do it from me.
And if anybody wants to form a community in the Monterey area of California, if there's anybody else out here, I'm here. Naval Postgraduate School's out here, and I'd be happy to host events for the local community. Fantastic. So.
Right. And I'm sorry, Fred, the acronym I could not remember is DMV, the District
Department of Motor Vehicles.
No, I think it means the District of Columbia, Maryland, and Virginia, DMV. So anyway, that's the one. Yeah.
Perfect. So with that, I'm going to continue the introduction of Winn, who gets less time than that. So Winn Schwartau is, I've known him for a long time. People historically have asserted that we were somehow in violent disagreement with each other over the years. But in fact, we never had any big disagreement with each other. So that just tells you that, people are trying to express their influences. And of course, I don't think anybody there was malicious, although you never know. Some of them were certainly unfriendly about it. So Winn promotes himself as a cybersecurity and influence guru. And I think I think guru is a good term for it. He's going to talk about the Metawar Thesis, which is he's going to talk about defending enterprise cognitive infrastructure, but I think it's much broader than that. And so I'm not going to preempt his talk by giving you the rest of the description, which you can read by yourselves. I'm really just going to have Winn share his screen, and I'm going to stop sharing mine. And so Winn, you should be able to share your screen now, and we will be quiet and listen. If anybody wants to ask a question while this happens, you can certainly put it in the chat box. We're not going to interrupt him during the talk, except if he says, just go ahead and interrupt me.
Anybody can interrupt at any time. Thanks, Fred. I appreciate it. And the IPA is new to me, but I hope to make some new friends and acquaintances. I'm going to get right into this, and because I don't have a whole lot of time to give you, as Fred said, several years of thesis work that is finally coming to a head. And I've called it Metawar, and it began, if I can find, which is the right button, yeah. The Metawar Thesis began 4 or 5 years ago with a real simple question that I was going to address similar to information warfare way back when, was what are the security and privacy implications of the metaverse? And I thought it was initially going to be a pretty cut and dried technical description of the geekisms and all the stuff that goes on in the back ends of it. And as I progressed and met with audiences, as I was testing the material, and largely in Europe because of political reasons and extremist policies here in the US, I was able to get really redirected, and that's when my metanoia occurred, that I had been looking at the entire issue of the metaverse and Metawar entirely wrong. And so I sort of had to begin all over again last spring. So I begin with the question is really, what is the metaverse? And we hear Neil Stephenson's vision, we got Ready Player One, we got all of this stuff that's great technology, immersive technology. And yes, those are all going to be components of evolving and future metaverses. But I make the following claim that the metaverse, as we are now conceiving it and as we are now living it, is the most powerful and addictive reality distortion machine that's been ever conceived. And we seem to be good with that at this point, and I am not good with it at all. And that is part, again, of that metanoia I had. I said, no, there's something very, very fundamentally wrong here. And it took a number of years to work on. So metaverse history, I'm going to argue that the metaverse is nothing more than a storytelling medium. If you're sitting around the campfire in ancient Greece listening to Homer tell the story of Odysseus, if he's a good storyteller, you are immersed in that experience. As technology evolved, we became immersed in reading when movable type, China, Gutenberg, whatever, became available to more of the masses, even just for reading of religious texts back in those days. The degree of writing, the skills with writing is about the skill of immersion, just as it is today when we read I'll say novel, and boy, you're into it, and then suddenly you're sipping your glass of water and you go, oh, I'm not in Victorian area anymore. I'm really sitting in my library reading. And it's that shift of perception and reality of that the metaverse is about. And regardless of the technology, really doesn't matter. Because then along came radio, and how many thousands of people absolutely believe the Martians are coming down and we got to go out with our 6-shooter and fight them. That was reality distortion through an immersional experience of audio only. Then along comes TV, 3D, all of the technologies that are now creating more and more immersive experiences. And at the end of it, at the hypothetical end of it, is what I call the meta point, the holodeck. And this is where there is absolutely indistinguishable between the reality of our consensual hallucination as we live and breathe as we think we do, and an artificial immersive environment. Are they the same? The brain says they're identical, but in terms of our awareness as we think it is with a physical universe, things start really changing an awful lot. So that's what I started to explore. And the Metawar thesis really came down to storytelling, regardless of the technology, and how immersive can I make it? That's how good a storyteller I am. People need to be. Can you make it absolutely believable? And I've done this in public, and I've said, everybody close their eyes, and I'll start to tell some nonsense story, and then suddenly bring them out of that for them to be able to experience that sudden shift in what occurs between consensual hallucination and a subjective reality with the story that I'm telling. Because I am trying to distort your reality in order to get my narrative across. In the larger picture of things, this is more about TMI, too much information. There's a huge amount of political discussion, that's a separate issue, on disinformation, misinformation. And when you really look at the volume of information since the information age, if you will, the curve 1950s up has been beyond exponential. We, as human beings, now have to deal with too much information, disinformation, bullshit, which is a legitimate psychological academic term these days, are all subsets of the universe of information. Once I, as an influencer, as the narrative, as the storyteller, I can then begin using these techniques to manipulate what goes on inside of your mind in distinction to our consensual hallucination. How do I make it even stronger? I add a reward system. Once the reward system is in place, that creates the addictive cycles. We get compliance at the end of the day, and whether we're seeing this through politics, belief systems, disinformation, conspiracy theories, doesn't matter, because at the end of the day, it creates belief. And belief is part of this huge schism that we're seeing because of TMI and the entire culture that we're dealing with today. Why is that button? There we go. So there's three classes of Metawar. I'm not going to get into them all because they're fundamentally very, very similar, and they echo the work on information warfare from the early 90s. Personal, loss of identity, who's in control of my life? How do I have any agency left if everything else is being decided for me? The algorithm, if you will. Enterprise faces similar sorts of threats at the institutional level, using these similar types of techniques by getting groups of people or individuals to be able to think and perceive, have their subjective perception and reality, belief of what your organization is. And then obviously at the class 3 level, what we've seen with misinformation, disinformation between nation states, NGOs. Same thing back in 1991. Congress told me, Schwartau, you're out of your mind. No countries are ever going to use the internet for warfare. And I was like, okay, fine. I'm Chicken Little. Yeah. This is the same model that's moving along, except we have the historical context for it going back well over 100 years and seeing what's going on these days. When we look at disinformation warfare, this goes back to what the Soviets have been doing for an awful long time. And if you ever have a chance, please do look up Yuri Bezmenov, because his work as an alleged journalist for the Soviet Information Agency from the 1960s through the 80s was the design templates for what we are seeing today in terms of application of Metawar techniques against their political or global adversaries as they see it. We have fundamentally a subjective experience and a objective experience, but our number one object as human beings is to survive. We survive by taking in all sorts of stuff and then predicting the future stochastically with some degree of accuracy, we hope. And we make an awful lot of mistakes, and we'll get into some of that. Now, the interesting thing here is about processing power. When you look at the processing power of the known neuronal and connections and synaptic connections in the brain, best guesses today is our unconscious, unaware, we don't see or experience it or can't touch it really. Unconscious processing is running at about 400 billion bits per second to keep our machine going. Our conscious, aware ability to have conversation, to have some critical thinking is roughly 4 kilobits. Makes me question who's in charge of what's going on in our brain. And we have two realities. And as the great philosopher David Chalmers says, regardless, it's all in your head. A memory creates the same neuronal patterns as an experience, with a little less definition perhaps, but the organization of memory and experience are right on top of each other. They map completely, which allows disinformation campaigns, etc., through the Metawar Thesis and the 8 steps that are involved in there to take hold and create new realities. And this comes down to how much of a believer are people? And belief has a spectrum, in my opinion. And then there are those two binary ends of it. I absolutely do not believe, there is no way, I'll stake my life on it. Or on the other hand, there absolutely is that way. I have absolute, complete, total faith and trust in something. As growing up in science and engineering, I kind of don't believe anything, because anything is subject to change at one point or another. And unless there is some degree of topical evidence that's within our consensual hallucination, it becomes superstition. And this becomes very, very difficult when we are trying to counter some of the effects of the Metawar Thesis on population. Not going to get into all of this. The book does a huge amount of it, getting into understanding the cognitive capacity and how the brain actually absorbs input to its sensory system, the limits to it. And when we look on the left there, that is the bandwidth of the stimulation to our brain, 11.1 megabits per second. That's it. How is that controlled? How is that? Sorry about that. How does that get an impact from too much information? If you've ever seen a video of what autistic children see visually, it is extraordinarily disorienting because of TMI. And this goes throughout our entire sensory systems. And how do I manipulate all of that? Then, with what we're trying to do today, we want to know how you're reacting. So we want the face tracking, the biometrics. We want to know exactly how you respond to any of these sensory inputs, in order to be able, so that we, the machine, the algorithm, can then refeed it back to you based upon your particular response to what we gave you before. I have a huge problem with this, and it's called active meta content orchestration. It's building a movie. It is building a TV show. It is building any sort of representation, whether it's deep fake artificial CGI or some practical implementation. Doesn't matter. The goal is, how do I influence your senses using emotional triggers, intellectual triggers, in order to get you to react to specific types of stimulus? We also have a huge amount of invisible content delivery mechanisms that go straight to the unconscious brain. And again, I'm not going to get into all the details here, but after spending a couple of years looking at this as a network system of inputs and outputs, answers started appearing that were not intuitively obvious, at least to me, and I had to spend a lot of time figuring it out. When you look at what the results are of what you're trying to do with any sort of sensory stimulus, this is sort of the emotional spectrum that is been used by Hollywood and authors and any content creators of what do we want the audience to experience. Tower of Terror. What do we want the participants in that ride to experience? What do we want them to feel? And how can we amplify those effects using psychological techniques, which again is part of those 8 steps in the Metawar Thesis. If you haven't read this patent, I really suggest you do. because what Apple is very specific about is putting in several dozen specific biometric sensors into a future generation of EarPods that will be able to sense all of the biological functions in the body, feed them back into Apple so that they can return to you based upon some set of criteria that we don't know, some set of algorithms, content based upon your physical and physiological responses to the content being delivered to you. This is the big picture of how to compare what is known as the contemporary senses. We're not going to get into some of the other issues right here. And we see that there are slightly different things. What we care about as just in traditional security, and I ended up looking at the entire Metawar thesis through the eyes of cybersecurity, since that's what I've been doing for a long time. And I look at time and synchronization. Synchronization is a huge component. If you're watching TV and suddenly you get a stutter, that brings you out of that immersive belief, of that little artificial hallucination that you're having. Synchronization is required. Latency, you don't want your time and audio and all of the other senses to be out of sync. They all have to tie together. And of course, we have confidentiality and integrity, which we'll get into a little bit. Where the tech is going, Colorado, you may have just read this morning, is passing some legislation that will make this type of brain reading illegal outside of specific types of medical procedures. In this case, the image on the right is a mental pickup of what somebody is looking at, that image on the left. Is it going to get better? Yep. How long is it going to take? I don't know, but it's going to get better. Should we be able to do this and take this information and feed it back in, or should we be able to read it at all? What are the policies? What are the technologies behind these types of consideration? And then ultimately you have to decide how much of the reality that you believe you have as an objective observer really is real. How much of it has been induced into you or can be induced into you, and you're unaware of it because of the processing capabilities of the mind. So now let's add AI into this, because at the back end of this mess that we're creating, it's AI, it's the algorithm. And we created AI in our image, and we're not liking what we're seeing, but we're moving forward, aren't we? And most of you know well how pendulums and biases work in this world. But again, the question is, who is in control of taking our biometric responses to the content that is being provided to us? And what do they do at the back end? We don't know, because the transparency doesn't currently exist. How good is AI? I use ChatGPT. I enjoy getting ideas. It's kind of like talking to somebody who's willing to go outside of their comfort zone. But from a fact standpoint, I find AI and all this stuff pretty darn useless. And what we haven't addressed is the emotion of the AI. They keep saying, is it conscious? Is it not conscious? And I was at CES and I was talking to all these AI companies, and I said, this is all great, but what do you do if the AI gets pissed off at you? How can you trust any of it? No answers, because we're not at that point quite yet. Cybersecurity, folks, this is our new attack surface. This is how the system works. Those are the hard numbers. We understand what they are. We can look at them from the same way that we look at technology today, because neuroscientists, experimental psychologists have done a huge amount of work for us already. Now, humans were built to survive against lions and tigers and bears, oh my. We were born and trained over the last 50,000 years, roughly, to be able to survive against nature, whether our life expectancy was 20 years, 40 years, doesn't matter. That was the built-in, what Daniel Kahneman says is system one, our innate, primal reaction system based upon habituation for survival. We didn't have technology 50,000 years ago. We didn't have huge amounts of information to have to contend with. We didn't really have that until the 1950s. Prior to that, technology and information overload, while Some people talked about it back in those days. That was with regards to, now we have 8 books in our library. That's entirely too many. So within the context of those eras, the concept of TMI was vastly different than what we're facing today. But we were not built for survival against information. And it's taking Kahneman's work, System 1, that just wants us to survive. System 2, though, is where we get into executive function, cognitive thinking, actually being able to make, using those 4 kilobits to come up with answers outside of our automatic knee-jerk reactions in System 1. System 1 is to keep us alive. System 2 should be able to help us coexist with the technology that we're building all around us. And this is the key thing here. It's not all about disinformation. It's not all about one thing or another. These are all elements of us as a species learning how to coexist with the technology that we've created and is now running the planet. So these are some of the charts. I'll make a couple of these slides available to you guys. And these are the 2 systems inside our brain that we're trying to balance. And the imbalance between these systems is also a lot of what we see with political polarization, religious polarization, the issue of belief, non-belief, or science evidence-based somewhere in the middle. Neither System 1 nor System 2 alone is going to do it, and we need to figure ways to be able to get them to integrate and coexist themselves in processing so we make better decisions. Our bodies, as I said, were not about survival against information, but we did have some fundamental mechanisms that were reactive through the 5 senses. And these are our 6 pieces of survival, the 6 F's, if you will. And there's nothing we can do about them. They are there. But none of them are information-based survival. That has to engage System 2 thinking. So here are again some of the numbers of what's been happening. As you'll see, is the digital and traditional information trend. We are moving, and only in the last few years, you'll see it's 2017 roughly, the asymptote and the curve said, whoa, now everything has gone digital. But how digitally attuned is the large percentage of humanity? Not very well, from everything that we know as cybersecurity folks as well. So what do we have? We've got stuff, and I wrote about this 35 years ago. We have digital schizophrenia. Do we love tech? Do we hate it? Are we confused? Are we scared of technophobia? All of these are emotional responses to the technology around us. And we have not yet been able to figure out or recognize that from looking at it in a cybersecurity way, how do we differentiate and how can we get people to better coexist with technology, because they have no choice if they're going to be part of society. One of the biggest ones is algorithmic anxiety, meaning we have handed over control of huge amounts of the input that comes into our life, the information input that our 5 senses pick up, the too much information. Somebody else is in control, not us. And that becomes, as we've seen with credit scores, with the denial, with profiling, all of those kinds of issues make it even much more of a intrinsic fear and lack of confidence in the technologies that is surrounding us. Stress is adding to it. We hear about massive amounts of stress. 40% of teenagers in the United States have some degree of depression. A component of that is tech stressing, FOMO, addiction, and range anxiety. When's my battery running out, and am I prepared to have another one? For those folks, like a lot of cybersecurity folks, yeah, we got a couple of extra battery packs with us because we think about it. But it creates stress for large amounts of the population, which makes filtering of TMI and understanding how to coexist with technology even more difficult. The picture on the left, I can't help but use. That's a 5 megabyte hard drive. And I kind of use that date was, okay, That's when TMI began. We can argue about that exact number, but the curves are astounding as to what we are dealing with and how we need to make decisions about what we as human beings are able to trust, not trust, and can our brains actually absorb it, or does it go into an alternate control mechanism like the 8 steps of the Metawar Thesis? I mentioned about the info glut. All this information out there, ultimately, we have never really been trained as a society how to go about identifying, picking, and choosing within the available 1,440 minutes of a day. How much time can we allocate to information of any sort, any mechanism, any media format? And how much of it do we actually choose that we want because it has value? This is not something that has been built into our ability to coexist with the technology that we've created. Some recent studies have come up, and here they are. TMI is the fertile ground for misinformation, disinformation, and very well could be the leading cause of disinformation and what happens as a result, according to the Metawar Thesis, because we have not learned how to control this yet. Now, control can be technological, it can be policy, it can be cognitive, and those are all the different ways that need to be looked at through an interdisciplinary approach to this as to how we can better coexist with it in light of the hard science numbers that we now know. How do we deal with unknown content? We, cybersecurity folks, science people, we tend to be exceedingly comfortable with it. But people that don't like the unknown, they want the absolute assurance of things, are finding additional levels of discomfort and then falling into allowing the algorithm to make decisions for them, to, in my opinion, not the benefit of humanity. So strengthening this means that we need to be able to strengthen the cognitive immune system, similar to strengthening the biological immune system, either through active inoculation, passive inoculation, mRNA style inoculation, in order to get system 2 to engage, in order to avoid pure system 1 knee-jerk reactions to everything. And this, again, is a simple OODA loop. And you'll notice there that instead of on the left, which is a typical OODA loop of how processes work, what we want to do in the cognitive process at this point is pause. Pause. Your mom said, take a breath, count to 10. Think about it overnight. All of those old comments that we grew up with are part and parcel of getting system 1 thinking to engage system 2 thinking in order to raise and elevate the skills involved in cognitive processing. We have to get it to pause. So we've got on that chart at the bottom, on the left with the green, we'll call that system 1 stuff. And so much of our lives are purely system 1 survival oriented. We never think about it. You don't think about driving most of the time because it has been habituated into our system 1. When we start thinking cognitively aware, that's when we start moving the dial over. And it's not a binary function. It's a combination of the balance between system 1 and system 2, because both are needed. System 1 is really, really, really fast. System 2 is really, really, really slow. And we need to find that balance in the middle to properly be able to coexist with the world around us. I took a model of some work that we had done with analog network security, time-based security, and the chart on the right is roughly the same thing. How do we get the primal survival mechanism to press pause, to take that breath in order to engage system 2? And I'm using similar models to some things that we all should be very comfortable looking at. We pause. It's that simple. We need to pause. But how do you pause? What makes pause? And what makes pause is what makes headlines, what makes disinformation and conspiracy stuff so attractive. It's grabbing attention. It's wow. It's really. How much do you fall into it? How much do you not fall into it? But pausing, some of the best mechanisms for that are the wow factor, grabbing attention, of course. But the other one that is going to be heavily a part of any endeavors, many of which I'm involved with now, is ask a question. Because asking a question has a very similar biochemical effect and addictive effect by releasing feel-good chemicals in the brain, just the way a digital reward system does. The chemical responses are of the same neural order. So we go back to the 60s, and this guy, William McGuire, he said, I know how to fix everything. I want to modify people's attitudes through inoculation. And that was paralleling so many of the successes with vaccine inoculation that started occurring in the mid part of the 20th century. Then nothing really happened. Neuroscience hadn't come to the forefront. Experimental psychology, all of the data science behind it didn't really exist. And then in 2018, two Dutch professors at Cambridge said, hey, what happens if we play a game? And they created a game using a technique called pre-bunking. And the pre-bunking says, they're looking at it from the misinformation, disinformation standpoint. How can I get somebody to less believe a piece of bullshit? And they do it by pre-bunking, showing an example, non-contentious issue. Bananas are blue. Non-contentious issue. But by using that statement and teaching them that, hey, sometime in the next few days, few weeks, somebody's going to try to convince you that bananas are blue. Don't believe it. It's a pre-bunking that gets the attention of System 1 as a defensive mechanism. And they found over millions and millions of cases that this works, that there is a significant, roughly 51% increase in the ability to detect misinformation, disinformation. Again, that's the focus of their studies. When a game, and they began with a game called Bad News, and they got amazing results. Study after study, the meta studies after it have confirmed them all, that the pre-bunking mechanism actually works, because we're dealing with an OODA loop. We're dealing with an OODA loop of somebody trying to do some BS information versus what you are the recipient of, with the influence and manipulation through content, or the results of your feeding back to them your metabiological data. This OODA loop can be strengthened using these techniques. Then after the pause, people are going to say, oh, we got to teach critical thinking. We have to do all of these things. Absolutely, I totally agree. But you've got to get people's attention first. So games like this work really well in the enterprise, getting entire portions of your entire workforce to be able to have an equivalent of security awareness types of training, except in this case, it's, bad news games. And there's the 6 main issues on the left that came out of Cambridge, out of Melanie Tracy King, her work in education, teaching logical fallacies. These are after the pause, and in enterprise, you can get people to play. You can get them to participate, keeping in mind that none of this has anything to do with contentious issues at all. It's all about agnostic issues and how to view and how to handle System 2 thinking when you're engaging with it. This has become something of a minor industry that is not been exposed heavily into our world yet, and that's a lot of the effort that I've been playing with. All of this is also about fundamental privacy. PII goes away. It doesn't matter anymore. The currency of the future is our new DNA, personally identifiable behavior. Once I feed you information, content of any sort, and I measure what's coming back over time, you're just telling me how to manipulate you. PIB. Europe is already starting. I'm talking with the European Commission about how can we turn off the algorithm? Can it be done? Well, technically, turn the damn thing off. Like buttons, introduce digital opioids into your system. Is that good for 8-year-olds? Florida said, well, we're going to ban social media. That's not the answer. You can't ban things. But looking at turning off algorithms, turning off those things that directly create addiction and bad behavior, we do have some mechanisms and ideas how to do that. Addiction, whether it's at the kids level in school, beginning with the 4-year-olds on their device, all the way up through adults that get caught into echo chambers, inability to filter information. This is all about the kind of addictions that are occurring because of the loops that occur, and we have not done anything yet about firmly cutting, absolutely cutting part of those loops to avoid it. What are the policies going to be? Do we care enough? Should we be able to do reality distortion technologies? We need to address that one. When I look at this again, I've taken the cybersecurity view of looking what is going on. Let's take some, and are they exact parallels? No, but they become for me a very convenient way to look at comparable metaphorical type of issues between the two systems, the technical silicon systems and our cognitive carbon-based systems. I found this to be useful, and I can't wait for more discussion to come along with it. This is the Metawar Thesis. This is what it's going to require. We're going to need a lot of people with a lot of different skills to hone and fine-tune and figure out, non-politically, without agenda, without anything other than how can we get humans to better coexist with technology. That is the art and science of Metawar. Thank you for your attention.
And thank you for presenting it. So, Winn, I'm going to pop up with the first question, but I ask everybody else who has questions to please put them in the chat box or just raise your hand and we'll try to unmute you. We may run over time, but that's perfectly all right. My first question, Winn, has to do with the notion of digital twins and using digital twins potentially to bridge the gap. So, the fundamental, and you're probably aware of this concept, right? But the idea here is that besides our what you call system 1 and system 2, if we have something in the digital environment that's looking to intervene so that it sort of forces things from system 1 into system 2 when they meet certain circumstances, or automate some of the system 1 responses to limit the external view of what we can do. Is this something that you think is a viable technological approach to mitigating this for the vast majority of people?
I kind of view that as a tactical versus strategic approach at this point. That's really once you get down to specifics and you've got goals and you know what you're trying to achieve, either as an organization or as a culture, as a municipality. That's how do you actually get it done at that level? Digital twins, yeah, they have an application, but I couldn't possibly begin to tell you right now exactly where I would put that into the mix.
Fair enough. Chris Blask, you had a question. Unmute yourself, please, and ask.
Happy to. So first, Winn, thanks. As you know, you and I have discussed this an awful lot as an example of the value of structured information that gives a lot more talk about. And you had mentioned that we're not built to handle disinformation, and I wonder about that. And if you think it might add some tools on our belt, but go back to not even just human evolution. The first creature with an eye spot, as soon as it was able to detect a predator above it, it selected itself out of that loop and drove the evolutionary process. So and through human history, not believing everything we hear is built into our every culture. So I'm wondering if we don't perhaps have some inherent abilities built in to deal with information attack structures, I guess, rather than saying information warfare.
There is some research, and I've only found this in the last few months, Chris, and it doesn't seem, I have not gotten the impression that it's really hard yet. The word that comes up is that humanity has some degree of innate skepticism. Now, I have not seen a study yet that says skepticism of the lion behind the tree or the skepticism of information on carved into a steel or information that comes at me. I've not seen any of that yet, and I would love to if people know about it. But there is the issue of skepticism seems to have some innate issue. How it directly ties to information overload, I have not seen it yet, but please educate me. Sorry, I couldn't answer that better, Chris.
No, you're doing good. So now you talk about too much information, and that maybe is inherent in the nature of the internet and so forth today. But too much information tends to produce errors of omission. And then on the other side, we have too little information, which produces errors of commission. And then there are errors of substitution with having just the right amount of information. Can you talk a little bit about those other modalities, or have you not thought through those?
No, that's where we get in the true psychologists, the people that are really that know that stuff. Again, I want to iterate. I started this thing trying to look at the technical aspects of how the wires are going to be connected to each other and latency and deep servers. I was looking at it that way, and I learned a lot, and I certainly covered in the book. But I'm going to relegate. We need a lot of expertise, and in any group gathering, Fred, hopefully there's a table that says, I'm experimental psychologist and I can answer that question. That's not my area of expertise. I'm trying to frame a discussion, and if I can do that alone, I'm going to feel happy. I'll be satisfied.
All right, so just along those same lines, until somebody else comes up with a question, I'll ask you a few, because I have no limit to the number of questions I can. But so when you talk about the requirements for being effective in this process, and a minor glitch can take you out of that illusion, right? So this calls for consistency, yeah, and that means the right amount of information of the right sort presented in the right way. And we had goodness gracious, I can't even remember his name today, Rand Waltzman. We were discussing these things with, and he talks about immersion, first-person presence, and then embodiment. Right, that is the transition from something out there to something inside you.
Yep.
As part of this process, and one of the things he identifies is this multimodal consistency. So today we don't really have multimodal consistency in most of these meta environments, right? So you'll hear something a little bit different. It will be off a little bit and so forth. Can you talk about what you anticipate that's going to reach, at what level of fidelity it has to get to be truly effective against even the best defender? And then after you answer that, we'll ask Juliana to unmute and ask.
Well, I've been trying to keep it within contemporary technology for the examples, because tomorrow's technology is going to be faster, better, and all those great things. When you're sitting and reading a book and you are completely immersed in it, and then your spouse suddenly goes, Fred, well, that's
which
enough.
She does.
That's enough to pull you out, because you're being removed by that attention-getting thing that goes to system one, and your system one is saying, I better listen to my wife, in your case. So it's going to get deeper and deeper. We already have the capability of being completely lost and immersed mentally, even without VR or any of that. Going to a great movie. All right, I'm going to go to the 70mm HyperMax thing, and I went to the Sphere in Vegas to see what that was like. They are incredibly immersive, but getting triggered out of it is pretty simple too. How's that going to evolve? That's meta warfare, isn't it?
Yep. Focus of attention. Juliana, unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much. I very much enjoyed it. And I also enjoyed very much the method of delivery, which is very charming. And I congratulate you. Not everybody can do that. My question, and it is partly a concern / question, has to do with the fact that I should perhaps preface this by saying that I was born in a communist country and lived there long enough to know that actually what you hear all the time, nonstop, is often exactly what you don't believe. I don't recall, this was under communism, and I don't recall anyone who believed a word, oh, well, maybe a word of what we were hearing. So my concern now, having lived here in this country for rather long time, is not so much that we have too much information, about which I have a question, but that we don't have enough of the important information that happens to be true, and moreover, information that many people consider significant in order to understand one another as a community. So the question, having made the comment, has to do with the inference that is implied in TMI beyond what you suggested, namely manipulating algorithms properly and so on. It has to do with the inference that perhaps there should be some deciders who will further diminish the amount of information. And of course, that all sounds very quantitative, but it eventually, if not always in the first place, becomes qualitative. And that is of serious concern.
Absolutely. Again, in a 30-minute presentation to show what I've done in 5 years is a little bit difficult. That's why I'm back to TMI and the model I use and think in cybersecurity terms. Very simply, let's go back to the 90s or 80s when Fred and I first met. And I got all this stuff, this information coming into my computer. And then in those days, it was, oh my God, which one's going to be a virus? All right. What do? We built an early generation filter. What we have not done, and then it gets better and better in theory. And is it perfect? No, absolutely. But we have built a series of layers, defense in depth, or I call it detection in depth mechanisms, where everything's fine, it's fine. Okay, block that, that's fine. Oh, I got to look at that more. Go engage this system over here for further forensic analysis. Those decisions were made by the administrators of the policies for that particular organization. I'm arguing that a similar model exists within the mental immune system, and it needs to be strengthened so that people have the ability to make better choices on their own and recognize the value of those choices based upon their criteria, their own sets of ACLs versus a third party.
All right, I'm going to just add a notion to that, Winn, that you're also going to need some sort of a third party provider when you can't make the difference yourself. And just as the way antivirus works locally, you can detect the stuff you know about. Eventually, you have to go look somewhere else. When it gets to the truth, the whole notion of science is repeatability of experiments and so forth. So that involves third-party justification and verification.
Fred, are you sharing your screen on purpose?
I am, because we're getting towards the end and I want people to be aware of the next event that's coming up. But Chris Blask, unmute yourself. You're already done, and ask your question.
Right. So I'll try to Alex direct this and put it in the form of a question, but it speaks to both Juliana's point and I believe what Thomas said in the chat, and to what you're saying, when so to Juliana's point, what an authoritarian regime tries to do with a misinformation campaign is not just convince people, but to a lot of Winn's point, just to block up the channel. We are only capable of consuming so much information. And like in cybersecurity, we call it a denial of service attack. Just send enough requests to some system that it reaches its maximum, but no longer handle requests. So filling up that channel, I think Winn is a big part of what TMI is. Juliana said this, but we have so much information that our a window of time, our time to transparency window where we can process any of that is full. So to Juliana's point, we don't have mechanisms to get to the individual points we want. And just and leading, I guess, to the question, when I think that we're at this point where there's economic incentives laying around. And to hear in the chat right here that someone is working on a new social media platform where this is the topic they're thinking about, kind of reinforces that, and interested in your thoughts. Do you think we're so buried in the ubiquitously buried in the disinformation soup that it's like we're into this constant DDoS attack, to the point where any incremental gain may be the economic drivers or the social drivers, where an incremental gain of lowering that is suddenly a business opportunity? If that wasn't too complicated.
I don't have an answer, because until we get a room full of people who have never met each other from different disciplines, I don't think that, especially in our world, we know cybersecurity. We understand modeling, we understand systems. I really want, that's why I'm headed over to England. I'm going to be talking with all of the psychologists and neuroscientists who did these studies out of Cambridge and out of Holland. And I'm going over next week. And I want to know a great deal that is not knowledge in our field. I want to know from the social psychologists, how does that work? How is that going to influence? We can look at it very granularly. We can look at it very scientifically, because that's the way we grew up and that's the way we live. But so much of this is soft science that we're trying to merge. And that's why that one of the last slides was, give me 50 different disciplines. Some of the mathematics that came out of TMI to disinformation. Wow, that was really interesting. And if I hadn't spent, umpteen endless hours going down rabbit holes, I may never have found that. I don't know the answer to most of this stuff, Chris. I know a lot of the questions, and I have the framework for discussion.
So we're getting towards the end of the hour here, and I just want to, we are having a meeting, hopefully in a couple of months, in the Washington, D.C. area, where we will have a lot of people from different places and different levels and types of expertise. But unfortunately, when per your specification, I will be there, as will you and Chris, perhaps. So we won't be with people who've never met each other. But having said that, I just want to close here. I noticed Pablo has joined the call. We're planning the next brown bag, which is on the screen. It's tentatively scheduled for Wednesday, May 15th. It might be a week later or earlier, depending on what we can actually get scheduled. And Pablo is going to be talking at that point about the disarm framework. And he's from the Disarm Foundation, as well as whatever else he does. Of course, all of us have more than one thing that we do in our lives. And this is a framework that's increasingly being adopted and adapted by global and national entities to support countering malicious influence operations. And Dr. Brewer is going to discuss that and how it came to be, what it's being used for, and how it can be applied. So we hope to see you there. Winn, I assume it's okay if we give everybody your email address and your personal cell phone number and your physical address and your wife's maiden name, so they can access your bank account in order to communicate.
All your bases belong to us.
There we go.
Hey,
all right.
Pablo.
So your slides.
Hello.
We've been asked about whether you can provide a copy of your slides and make them available on the IPA website. If you can, please do. But I'll understand if you can't. Your video will be available shortly after the meeting. I don't know how short shortly is, but I
Yeah,
want to
send me the
express
link
our
on that.
appreciation. Sure.
Send me the link. I'd appreciate it.
Yeah,
Fred, can anybody view the link, or do they have to be an IPA member?
I think you can share the link with people, and they should be able to view it if it's depending on where it is. There's a policy issue here that hasn't been fully decided yet, but historically they're available on YouTube if you have somebody that knows the URL. So we'll certainly provide that to you, regardless, a downloaded copy if nothing else.
And do they get a discount if they drink IPA beer?
So I think membership in IPA, John, correct me if I'm wrong, it's like $35 a year. So I think it's okay. And if you're really, really poor, we probably can get you a free or a gift membership for a year. So
yeah, that's correct. It's $35 a year. It's $90 for 3 years, or $250 lifetime membership. And yeah, with these brown bag videos, we've been putting them up on our YouTube channel as unlisted videos and posting the link in our Slack channel. But if you want to share the link with people you know, you're free to do so.
Thank you.
There you go. All right. So hopefully we'll see you all next month at next month's brown bag, and invite your fellow IPA members, and invite people who are not IPA members to join the IPA so they can get involved. And thank you very much. I think the deal is you don't have to go home, but you can't stay here.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Winn.